Guys, today an updated Wanderer guide. Wanderer is the type of character where you really need to get a lot of things right in order for him to perform well, so in this video I'll go over a bit of everything really. First of all, let me talk about what's probably the most debated topic about Wanderer, his combos. I'm not exaggerating if I say that in the past, people literally went to war for this argument. 6 and 3, 5 and 2C, 5 and 2D, 6 and 3, 3 and D... Okay, just to contextualize everything, during his chains, Wanderer has 3 types of attacks to deal damage. The first 2 are obviously his normal and charge attacks that get massively buffed by his elemental skill. As I'm sure you know, his skill enables his special stance, where he starts floating and becomes extra powerful. During this stance, his normal and charge attacks also gain a chance to proc his second passive. When active, this passive makes Wanderer throw some darts at opponents if you press the dash button with him. This is something that's very unique to Wanderer, because to this day he's still the only character in the game that can deal damage to opponents by dodging. Anyway, his combos are basically some combination of these 3 attacks. So straight away, assuming you have no specific buffs or attack speed bonuses, his charge attacks are very strong. Specifically, in this scenario, a combination of normal attacks and charge attacks, or even charge attack spam, is his best choice. This doesn't change even if you give Wanderer the Chronicle set that buffs his normal attack speed by 10%. Meanwhile, with more normal attack speed bonuses and buffs that specifically increase normal attack damage, normal attack combos become more competitive. The reason I'm only mentioning this for normal attacks and not also charge attacks is that this game has a huge bias when it comes to accessible buffs for normal attacks in particular. For example, we have Genshin that is a dedicated normal attack support that provides attack speed bonuses and huge, but more importantly, Wanderer's signature, Tula only buffs normal attack speed and damage with its passive. Truthfully, this has always been kind of a weird design choice because, as I said earlier, as a baseline, his charge attacks are stronger than his normal attacks in terms of damage. Not only that, but from a practical standpoint, his charge attacks also have wider AoE range. And for many people, this always made charge attacks the preferable options compared to normal attacks, even in situations where damage favored the latter. Anyway, as a rule of thumb, unless you're using his signature or have heavy normal attack buffers on your team, charge attack combos are generally better. Now, question, where does the dash attack come in all of this? As I mentioned earlier, every normal and charge attack has a chance of activating this special dash that will deal damage to opponents. It's a completely random thing, so it's hard to predict an exact combo that uses dashes. Also, since dashes kind of have a defensive nature, seeing them only from an offensive standpoint is probably wrong. This is especially true for Wanderer that suffers a quite big knockback if he gets hit. Also, his elemental skill stance has a point bar that represents its duration. This bar empties over time, but it empties faster if you dash. However, this won't happen if you dash while the passive is active. What I'm saying is that it will be wise to save these dashes for when you actually need to dodge. Again, it's something very unique to Wanderer, being able to deal damage while dodging, but partially it's because of the drawbacks I just mentioned. But if you're using a shielder or you are in a situation where you don't need to dodge, dash combos can be competitive damage-wise. I'm assuming a combo where you dash every 5 normal attacks, which should give you pretty safe odds to activate the passive every time. Also considering that his 3rd normal attack is a double hit that can trigger the passive twice. However, keep in mind that this won't occur if you're attacking too close to the opponent. This is because the passive has a cooldown of 0.1 seconds, and if you attack too close to the opponent, both the hits will connect simultaneously and instantaneously. This guy here begged me to talk about this, so here you go, hope you're watching this video. Let me remind you that if you enjoy my content but you haven't subbed yet, please consider doing so because it really makes me notice your support. So now, in terms of teams, Wanderer has one super essential teammate, and that's Furina. Specifically, Constellation 6, Furina. Since Anemo has always kind of been lackluster in terms of raw damage potential due to poor elemental reactions and elemental resonance, they put all it needed into this unit, Furina, that only becomes really good at Constellation 6. This is old news, I'm sure I don't need to repeat this, but that Constellation 6 alone is around a 30% damage difference for Wanderer. Literally 99% of Wanderer teams use Furina as its best in slot, so if you don't have her in the Constellation 6, that really limits your options. Moving on, a very important factor of Wanderer's team building is his first passive. Basically, it will grant him buffs based on what elements he came in contact with on his skill activation. Each one of them has its uses, but typically the Cryo, Pyro and Hydro ones are the ones that impact his damage the most. And that's why Bennett is a very strong teammate for him, close to Ferozan actually. Not only is obviously great buffer and healer, but his burst also makes it very easy for Wanderer to get the Pyro buff. Specifically, it applies Pyro to the active character, and that counts as an element Wanderer comes in contact with when he activates his skill. And that's why the Ferozan-Bennett duo is an excellent offensive core for pretty much every Wanderer team. Bennett is a very convenient teammate from a practical standpoint as well, because Wanderer is a ranged character that doesn't have to chase opponents throughout the room to hit them, so he can easily stay within Bennett's burst range. Anyway, starting from this trio, you can go many different ways, but something I want to talk about first is Furina teams. I'll keep it a buck. To me, the Wanderer, Furina, Bennett, Ferozan team is the best Wanderer team overall. Furina by herself enables very interesting options for Wanderer. For one, it makes him able to use the Marachusei set that is arguably better than the Chronicle set, and it also makes him able to use the Cash Flow weapon, the Priestly Signature, that is arguably better than Wanderer's Signature for him. For the rest, she's just a very good unit that will supply Wanderer with plenty of damage bonuses, even with Bennett on team as the only healer. The team feels very strong, and in terms of damage, it's the best Wanderer has to offer. In terms of rotations, use Furina's skill and burst, and then use Bennett's burst before Ferozan's. This is important because this way Ferozan will go on field later and get healed by Bennett's burst, which is good for Furina's stacks generation. Then, first thing I like to do when I go on field with Wanderer is use his burst, because it's a nice AoE hit and it's also good front load. This changes with the Constellation 2 that gives more value to using it later in the rotation, but otherwise I like using it earlier. It's just a very nice head start since it's a great AoE hit. It's certainly a team that functions at every investment level, but if you have Furina's Constellation 2 specifically, it gets much better. That's because that Constellation makes it trivial for Furina to get stacks for her burst, even with a single target healer like Bennett on her teams, so it's very good for this team specifically. Alternatively, I like the Furina Mika teams here. Mika is a team-wide healer that also provides attack speed bonuses for Wanderer. Sadly, it's only normal attack speed, but the team feels pretty good and fun to play nonetheless. The only real flaw this team has is that it can be hit or miss to get both the Cryo and Hydro buff for Wanderer's passive. Sometimes it will be both, and others it will be just one of them. The hope alternative here is Jean. Jean is kind of just worse Mika, because she's a team-wide healer like him, but at Constellation 0 she doesn't offer anything offensively. If you have a Constellation 4 that makes her burst inflict an emo resistance reduction to all the opponents that are standing within its range, she becomes more useful for sure, but still more inconsistent compared to Mika, because it's something that's circle impact dependent. Alternatively, if you want to make teams without Furina, you can try the Yelan variant, since Yelan is basically mini Furina in terms of kit. She really offers a lot of the same stuff, but unlike Furina, she doesn't open up new, better building options for Wanderer. Another team that is pretty decent is the Wanderer, Yunjin, Bennett, Ferozan composition, that in terms of Wanderer damage itself is actually the best team there is. That's because Wanderer is really getting a lot of buffs here, but on the flip side, the sub DPS damage is basically null. A big issue here, however, is that Yunjin is very bad in terms of particle generation, and sometimes it will be a problem to make her recover enough energy to use her burst again. Even if you give her a Favonius weapon, it's hit or miss, because you don't build her with crit, so the Favonius proc will be inconsistent. Then there are also other compositions that can integrate strong sub DPS well, like for example the Shelling teams, the official teams. The Shelling double pyro teams with Ferozan and Wanderer is specifically a very good composition this abyss, where you have the pyro blessing that can be enabled by Shelling, so it's a pretty great team this time around. Worth mentioning that triple anemo teams are also a thing with Kazuha, Venti, whenever you need a grouper on your team. Some cryo based teams with Rosaria or Keia to get the cryo buff from his passive as well. It really has a lot of options. Now, excluding everything I talked about, a big flaw for Wanderer is that he feels very vulnerable to use. Honestly, every time you get hit with him, it feels like you're getting your shit smacked by fucking Goku. Even with the dash passive, he doesn't feel very safe to use, and is pretty much a high risk, medium high reward character. Not only that, but on Bennett teams where he gets pyro applied on him, some types of hits will deal much more damage than usual. Due to all of these reasons, people love to use defensive options like shielders with Wanderer, and for good cause, I'd say. In the past, this didn't signify a big loss for him offensively, because he has some pretty interesting options for the shielders, but now the situation is a bit different. The problem is Furina. Furina teams are the best offensively for Wanderer, but they can can't integrate shielders. On Furina teams, assuming you're taking Furina, that only leaves one spot open and that will have to be filled by a healer. This is kinda bad because it means that the shielded teams remain the exact same for Wanderer as when he came out. The only new option he has in that sense are the double Geo teams with Chiori and Zhongli. I like this team, specifically compared to the Yunjin variants, because Chiori is much easier to manage in terms of energy compared to Yunjin, as most of what she does is coming from an elemental skill. On this team you get the Geo Resonance that makes the shield tougher, so it's probably the most durable Wanderer team you can play. Alternatively, another team I like a lot is the Thoma double Pyro team with Bennett. Thoma is a pretty strong shielder for normal attack damage dealers, and in tandem with Bennett he will also provide the Pyro Resonance. Moreover, if you have his Constellation 6, he will also give Wanderer normal and charge attack damage bonuses, which is nice. A similar alternative is Layla, but straight up, I don't like her. The reason is that while she provides normal attack buffs to her Constellation 4, and as a cryo character she can also allow Wanderer to get the cryo buff from his first passive, she can be very hit or miss at this last thing. That's because Bennett will melt off of her cryo application and remove it, which is something that can be fixed if you have Layla's Constellation 6 that makes her application faster, but otherwise it's just clunky. You can do something like avoiding to use Bennett's elemental skill, but then the energy economy becomes a mess, so basically, unless you have a Constellation 6, it's Thoma all the way. It's also worth mentioning some teams that are more durable than non-shielder teams, but not quite as durable as shielder teams, like the Beidou double Electro teams, the Xingqiu teams. These teams are nice, but they're certainly worse than others offensively, and not as durable as the most durable teams defensively, so they're a bit in the middle. Now, technically, there is a lot more I can say about Wanderer teams. Like, for example, if you really want, you can play him without Ferozan as a driver, sort of. Like, he's a normal attack spammer, so it fits well with characters like Yelan, Xingqiu, Fischl, all of these characters that can be driven. But it's just pretty obvious, like, no shit, he can be a driver to double Hydro teams and be decent. That's everybody, like, everybody can do that. Honestly, you can play Wanderer on a lot of teams and it'll be fun to use, but if you want to maximize his damage, you'll have to use characters like Ferozan, Bennett, and that's just the sad truth. And honestly, Wanderer is the kind of character that if his damage is not high and he doesn't kill the opponents early, so the opponents are allowed to fight back, he will face issues very quickly. That's because, as I mentioned earlier, he's a very vulnerable character, so he wants to be used on those teams that maximize his damage. Now, regarding his builds, stat-wise pretty straightforward. Offensively, he just likes attack, damage bonus, and crit. For the energy, pretty simple. If you have Ferozan Constellation 6 on your team that can battery him, he will need anywhere between 110 and 130 energy recharge to burst every rotation. Otherwise, if you don't have Ferozan Constellation 6, never ever think of bursting every rotation. For the artifacts, most of the time the Chronicle set is his best in slot, like it's his signature set, so it's obvious. Shimenawa is a solid alternative, although the burst definitely becomes more situational with it, and also you can't burst at the start of a rotation, because otherwise you won't have energy to activate the set, you will have to burst at the end. Meanwhile, the Marashuse set becomes the best in slot if you have Furina on team. For the weapons, his signature is the best option on non-Furina teams, otherwise Cash Flow Grizzly's signature is his best option. That's because Cash Flow is simply the superior weapon in terms of passive. It provides attack bonuses, it buffs both normal and charge attacks, and it also increases attack speed for both. Its one flaw is that its crit rate secondary stat makes it a bit hard to make it fit with the Marashuse set on Furina teams, because it becomes very easy for Wanderer to overcap on crit rate in those situations. But even if you use the Chronicle set with Cash Flow, it's still superior than Tulai Tula played with Marashuse. Alternatively, Wit set is a very good 4-star option, and one of his best options overall actually. 2 out of 3 of the buffs it provides are massive for Wanderer, so even though it's a pretty random weapon, on average it's great. Other options include Lost Prayer that on average is pretty great, Flowing Purity, a nice free-to-play option, Atlas, and so on. Regarding his constellations, they're not bad, but Fontaine has really warped the perception of what a good constellation is in my opinion. By this I mean he has pretty decent constellations, but compared to what Grizzly, Nubilette, Arlecchino, Furina have, they just pale in comparison. The constellation one is not bad, as it increases his attack speed in general, and it also increases the damage dealt by the darts from the second passive. So it's a good realistic damage increase, especially if you consider that he makes dodging, even less of a damage loss on Wanderer. The Constellation 2 exponentially increases the damage of his elemental burst depending on how much time of his elemental skill is left. It can even double the damage of the elemental burst, but it forces you to use it later in the rotation as opposed to early. It's a minor thing really, but personally I like the idea of such a strong AoE hit being a front-loaded damage tool as opposed to a back-loaded one. It's just more practical, because if you use it later you'll be more situations where the burst just ends up overkilling opponents, so you'll waste some damage. After this you either go to Constellation 6 or you stop at Constellation 2, there is no in between. The other constellations are just not worth the cost. So overall, Wanderer is still a pretty good character and also quite fun to use, but only when everything goes right. In a way, he's pretty similar to Arlecchino, so a high risk, high reward character, but I feel like for Arlecchino the reward is considerably higher at this point. He hasn't aged perfectly, mostly because Fontaine characters have stepped things up in terms of damage and quality of life. So compared to the past, he feels a bit worse to use. Still, he's nice, and if you like him, you'll definitely have fun with him. And I'm done for today. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and also go check the latest video I made about the best characters for the latest abyss, a tier list. Bye bye.